You are listening to the Fresh Take Network.
What it is, what to do, like a Fresh Take, Joshua, Adam, and Martha with Mr. David Legg.
I'm back. I keep getting invited back, Josh. I'm not really sure why, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, this is a subject that I think is kind of near and dear to everything you're going on that I wanted to talk to. That a lot of people have asked me, like, I guess kind of on a personal level. So we're obviously in the middle of the pandemic, and as people that listen, and I'm the voice of State Trojans Athletics, and it just came to my year anniversary of not calling games. And a lot of people have asked about, like, well, what's the future of State next year? What's the future of Mount Royal next year? So, I thought you were a great person to go to, and just kind of this past year in the pandemic with collegiate athletes and the no games and where we're going to go in the fall. Obviously, there's no clear plan in the fall because I know from already that I have, there's no clear plan, but just kind of talk about this past year and where everything is. I guess we kind of start first with what this past year has been for the University of Mount Royal with no sports.
Well, yeah, let me begin by saying it sucks.
Yeah.
so that's the benchmark that I'm starting with. I guess if you're really stretching it, you can find some windows of positivity and, where there's been benefit and stuff like that. But, as far as academia and university sport in particular, I think we'd be better on campus. It's been difficult. There's no question about it. Now, we often compare ourselves to the American system, which I think is inappropriate. And, just purely from a financial perspective, I think we were right to not host varsity games, particularly when we don't have students on campus. Now, again, in the US model, that's very different, right? But it would look a little hypocritical, would it not, if we're suddenly transporting, athletes to go play varsity games when we don't even have students on campus going to class. Now, then the question becomes, well, okay, moving forward, what's it going to look like in the fall? And, Mount Royal University, as an example, has not officially announced what's going to happen in the fall. We have committed and stated publicly that we'll decide that by the end of April. So theoretically then, if a decision is made, to do so, then theoretically we could say, okay, well, we'll start planning to host varsity sport again, starting in September. I did notice today that the University of Alabama announced that they're going to host, full stands in Bryant-Denny Stadium in Tuscaloosa, starting in late August. I think it's a little premature to be doing that.
There's definitely an American thing with the pandemic the past week. It's like, oh, we're good. We're like, numbers are coming down. We're back. We're getting ready to go back to normal. Like, there definitely is that sense in the States, and it's definitely not the same up here.
Yeah, my own personal opinion is that, perhaps they're jumping the gun a little bit, but listen, I'm trying to be respectful and recognize that it's a challenging situation for people, and people are chomping at the bit to get back to doing what they love to do. Organizations are chomping at the bit to get back to opening up the doors so they can start generating revenue and hiring people and continuing to progress in that respect. So I get it. I'm completely empathetic to those issues.
It's really hard. I mean, for me, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, but coming back to a Canadian context. If I had to look into a magic crystal ball, I would say, it's funny. I was listening to the news on the weekend, and I said to my wife that I think we've reached the tipping point, because the top 3 news stories were not about COVID. And so maybe that means, we're moving away from it. Although having said that, that I live in Cochrane, Josh, and my son's middle school, or not middle school, it's high school. We got the message last night from the principal saying, your son has been in contact with a person who has tested positive for COVID and needs to be quarantined for the next 2 weeks. So it's clearly still out there. It's clearly still infecting people. So, I also don't want to be naive and get overly enthusiastic and overly, excited about the possibility of opening up in the fall. But if I had to bet money, I would say we'll be back in classrooms in the fall, and knock on wood, we'll be playing games on fields and courts and et cetera next season. Now, where this also becomes interesting though, and so post-secondary education is funded provincially, and the provincial budget fell last Thursday, and a number of universities, particularly the University of Alberta, got hit pretty hard insofar as their revenue from the provincial government. And now universities have been allowed to increase tuition by certain percentage points. I think 7% is the maximum they're allowed to raise it per year, which many universities have done. And so students, of course, are not very happy about that. And I'm empathetic to that, and certainly, or sympathetic to that issue. I have three, three sons who are of that age where potentially they're going to be going to university or planning on it. So those are costs that I'll have to help bear. And so, will students push back on having to cover costs for varsity sport? Will universities, recognizing that they're getting decreasing revenue from the provincial government and perhaps not generating a lot of sponsorship revenue from corporate Alberta, because they're also dealing with challenges on a more global scale financially, will varsity sport be one of those things that universities say, hey, we seem to survive quite fine without it for a year? Do we really need it? And I think that will be
That's the worry.
I think that will be a legitimate question. And again, I'm not saying that with any real insight into what university presidents or athletic directors are having. I've not been part of any of those conversations. This is pure, this is my own ideas that I'm positioning here. Although other people have certainly, I'm sure considered this as well.
Yeah.
But it's a possibility, I think, to be aware of. And I think, for those of us who are supportive of varsity sports at the post-secondary level, I think it's important for us to, make sure that we are voicing our support and coming at it from an evidence-based perspective as to why it's important, the benefits and the values that it does provide for an academic institution and for the athletes and for the students who go to those institutions. I think maybe we will need to be a bit more systematic and specific as to the benefits, as opposed to just kind of assuming that these things will continue forever. And perhaps that's, if there is a benefit of COVID, maybe that's it. It's made us challenge some of the assumptions and some of the, preconceived notions that we have as to why we do things. And do we need to continue doing those things? I would argue that varsity sport is an important element of any campus institution, any campus life. But there are others who may not agree. And we need to be able to have those conversations.
We saw that with the Olympic vote.
Listen, very, very clearly, right? And so, clearly there was more than 50% of the people in Calgary who voted anyways, who didn't think it was a worthwhile endeavor at that time and a worthwhile investment. Could the same thing happen potentially with varsity sport at universities? If you had to ask the students, it would be an interesting vote, wouldn't it? Are you willing to pay part of your student fee to go towards the support of a varsity team on your campus? And if the argument can only be made that it's real, you're supporting the 12 basketball players, the 15 soccer players, et cetera, and there's really no other benefit for the institution, then a lot of students would probably be like, what do I care? So, as supporters of varsity sport, we need to do a better job, perhaps, or a good job of articulating why it's important and why it needs to be supported.
Well, and so I have a question too, when you're talking about the financial sides of things. So number one, were athletes this year, were they that were on scholarships, let's just say, were they still granted their scholarships this year? And also, do they, because I know some schools left a year of eligibility of play on some schools. Obviously, you can't speak for UFC or U of A or SAIT or whatnot, but as far as MRU, what was done there as far as divvying up scholarships and how that was used going forward with scholarships and eligibility as far as senior, first year player, second year player type of
now sadly I don't know the specifics of that, Josh.
Okay.
But those are good questions, and it's interesting. I suspect, my suspicion would be is that a scholarship would be honored as long as the student is still a full-time student.
Right.
And I think a lot of the teams still trained up until they were no longer allowed to train.
Right.
And so, moving into particularly in the fall, I think it was up until the end of November, teams were still practicing and training until the full lockdown came. I think that was in early December. So in that, in that context, then my expectation would be is that players would still be supported financially based on whatever agreement they had made with the institution or whatever, kind of mechanism they were getting supported with from a scholarship to begin with. The eligibility, my understanding is until you actually play a game and you step on the court or the field, that's what then constitutes as your year of eligibility. So my understanding is, and again, I don't know the intricacies of that, is that as long as you didn't play a full game, then you did not use up that year.
So it's like it would be for any year, right? Because we've had players, for example, on state that skipped a year, came back, they're in their fourth year, skipped another year, now they're in their fifth year. So that kind of goes the similar route. I guess the other thing is too, it's just going to be so interesting how many people want to go to games, right? And I think we kind of saw that, you talked about the financial saving side of things. We saw that with the U of L, with their hockey team going away. And I think a lot of it was a money saving thing because they hosted the Nationals. And once the U of L went out, nobody went to the games anymore. So they said, like, well, why are we hosting this when people want to only go to our team? And I think I think that was kind of getting looked at before the pandemic, the last 5 years of these schools hosting these nationals, or these provincials being like, well, unless if you're a state, you get, Ambrose and you get St. Mary's, cool, you got those. Or if you're Mount Royal or U of C, you have those two schools in there. But others are noticing if we don't have more of these regional teams, once those teams are out, there's not as many people going to these games. So it is a big money gulper for these provincials or nationals.
Yeah, well, and Josh, so let's think about this. And again, I am not saying that I've had any of these conversations, and there's probably all kinds of cons to what I'm about to propose. But you think about, okay, so COVID has now recognized that there are some challenges, perhaps financially, perhaps from a travel perspective. I mean, really, do you need to get on a bus and drive when there's you think about the Canada West versus the ACAC. And Mount Royal doesn't play SAIT anymore because we're in two different leagues. But really, does it have to be that way? I mean, can I not say, could the two leagues not, have a conversation and allow for league play to happen between the colleges and the universities in a Calgary context? I mean, think of this financial savings alone. If you were to allow the St. Mary's, the Ambroses, the Mount Royals, the SAITs.
I want the atmosphere as a broadcaster.
So you got 5 teams in a city as opposed to 2 or 3, depending on the league that we're talking about. The cost travel savings in and of themselves would be fabulous. Now, granted, I get, well, some universities might say, well, we're in the big leagues and, we don't want to, kowtow to a smaller school or whatever. Right? But those to me are smaller issues than the cost savings, perhaps the health and the safety of the athletes. The fact of, these are student athletes. And so, the fact we don't have to stick them on a bus and drive all the way to, I don't know, Manitoba or wherever, as opposed to driving, down Crowchild. So to me, that benefits the athlete from the student athlete perspective. It benefits their health. It certainly has financial benefits for the institutions. I think for the fans, actually, they would far prefer that, if I'm being honest.
Of course. You know how many times I hear man, for me as a broadcaster, I just miss St. Mount Royal games. I remember going as a fan. And it's so many people man, I wish we could face Mount Royal, because you see the Crowchild Classic and you see everything that brings up, right? It's a very exciting moment in Calgary. I'm not going to say it's like Flames and Oilers level, but definitely the Saddle Dome. You've been there for those games. The Saddle Dome is rocking for those Crowchild Classic games.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I'm kind of surmising,
Absolutely,
pie in the sky stuff here, and maybe it wouldn't work in every sport, but maybe in some it would. And so, why does it have to be all or nothing? Maybe it's every 5 years it gets readjusted, and it's maybe maybe it's like British soccer, it's regulation. And you've got Div 1 and Div 2, and people can go up and
really
go
love
down.
that idea. I love that.
I don't know. I think again, what COVID has done is it's made us question challenge some of these traditions that we've been following that we just assume are, well, no, that's the way it is.
Well, Zoom calls, right? You go and travel for these meetings, and now you're like, well, why wouldn't I just do it over the Zoom call instead? Like,
yeah. No, you look at how the Western Hockey League is adapted, right? I mean, the 6 teams in Alberta are only playing against each other. And, for those young men, that's saving them a lot of time from sitting on buses where you'd had to drive to Prince Albert or, I don't know, Brandon or whatever it is they have to drive to.
David, Briarcrest is in SAIT's division, and I never get it because all these Alberta teams have to make the travel to Briarcrest once a year. And God bless those kids from Briarcrest. Once pretty much every month, they're making a tour. Every week they're making a tour over Alberta, which I just never financially got. And just, in the cage of mental health and, you're studying and everything like that. You're going on a bus from Saskatchewan, which is pretty much Briarcrest, I believe is near Regina, all the way to Calgary. That's like a 9-hour bus ride both ways every week. I never got it.
And yet there are, certainly a number of schools in Saskatchewan, whether it's U of S or U of R, as examples.
Yeah.
And then, maybe then they have to combine them just because of the lack of schools with those in Manitoba. But Alberta could easily put together 10 teams.
Oh, yeah.
In a basketball context, anyways. Now, again, maybe it wouldn't work for every sport, but in some, I think it could. And again, I'm just kind of surmising, No,
I really love the relegation idea. I mean, this is kind of the final thing, because I know you're a little bit strapped for time today, but you have seen it. You've seen what the U of L did. You saw what U of A did. And obviously, I have a little bit of a close relationship to the U of A because my sister's in the U of A Hall of Fame. I always like to get that cheap plug in. But, they took away the basketball program and everything before this. And look, that was a financial saving situation for some of these teams. I know before, SAIT, before the pandemic, I was taking off the hockey broadcast to start saving a little bit of money. So you can, and then we saw the U of L stuff. So there was, before the pandemic hit, you saw these little saving monies of being like, well, we're really good on the hockey broadcast, but we only really need one hockey broadcast. Or something personal, but we just need one hockey broadcaster. We'll still do basketball, but we don't want to pay you these extra days, which I get. And you saw the U of L with what I talked about, and then what U of A did. So you kind of saw these things before the pandemic, and kind of what you talked about after. It's like, well, now it's kind of this clean slate before we go into the fall. What are we going to do? What do we want to keep? Where do we want to go with it?
Well, and again, university sport is part of the university. And so they have to recognize where they fit within the vision and the mission of the university itself. Like it's not a standalone entity, right? I mean, SAIT Athletics does not operate in its own little fiefdom. It operates as part of SAIT. And so when the provincial government, and I forget the exact numbers, but I seem to recall there was a number thrown around of 750 jobs that would be lost as a result of the budget cut. Well, I mean, those 750 jobs have to come from somewhere in the institutions. And the athletics and the recreation departments and student services and all those things are part of the university. And so, they all have to, they may all have to have a role to play in addressing budget shortfalls. And each institution will, address that differently. But some may choose to perhaps have their varsity sport teams bear more of the burden than other parts of the institution. Again, I think it'll come down to each institution to make those decisions, but that could then have an impact across the board, particularly. So the example that you've given 2 examples. So when the University of Alberta, for instance, decided early last year to pull all of their varsity teams, ultimately every school did the same thing, but U of A was just early to make that announcement. It had a domino impact when, Lethbridge, continues to no longer have men's hockey. I mean, that will have an impact on the Alberta landscape, because then there's, just one fewer team of which there's only 5 that play in Canada West. And now it's down to 4. And so that changes, again, the economies of scale as far as offering, men's varsity hockey.
Keep up, and there's a bunch of stuff for that too, right? So sometimes, that's why, in SAIT, the games end and you see the beer league come in right away, because it's like, we have to use this rink for other things than just SAIT.
Yeah, no, agreed. So there are philosophical discussions, but there's also the financial imperatives, the financial realities that all these institutions are dealing with.
I mean, and just to end it on a bunch of positive note, I do think most stuff is going to come back, and I'm hoping in the fall. I'm very hopeful. I mean, it's been a rough year. I mean, that for me, it's such an outlet, and for you, being involved in the MRU, I'm sure you get to see some of these athletes and watch them grow and watch the teams grow. So that's a thing that's taken out. And for me, like the year before the pandemic, it was the first year like I was involved in hockey, soccer, volleyball, basketball. So I really got to dig my heels into state athletics and really got to form relationships with the different athletes and root for them and watch some of these freshmen grow. And it's like, oh, well, I can't wait till the next year. Like our women's soccer team was an awesome story. They started off 0-5 and the girls really got into the playoffs. They didn't win, but it was like, oh man, I can't wait till these girls are sophomores and watching the men of the basketball team 4 ACC championships. It's like, can we get 5? And we have nationals next year. And then obviously with Mount Royal, everything going on there with the Crowchild Classic and just the excitement over there. I think the soccer team over there, I think was actually starting to gain some momentum for Mount Royal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no, you're right. They made the that's right. They made playoffs. I mean, if nothing else, maybe COED, again, to end on a positive note, does provide us with a blank slate and to create new traditions, to create new norms of how programs are run. Admittedly, we have not, certainly in my experience, had overflowing crowds at our varsity games, particularly the hockey, or not the hockey so much.
Right.
Well, women's hockey is, gets good crowds.
Yeah.
But like the men's and women's basketball or men's and women's volleyball as examples. And maybe all of a sudden, for whatever reason, people commit. The students are so eager to get back into a social atmosphere where they can, connect and collect and really feel that sense of belonging that, suddenly the gym at Mount Royal becomes like, and I know you agree with us, Josh, that Duke is the best university in the United States for men's basketball and has the greatest fan base for men's
it'd be
basketball.
nice if they made March Madness this year, but I mean, we can't all be 10 seeds.
But anyways, my point being is maybe, I don't know, maybe Mount Royal's gym becomes, Cameron Indoor North or something like that. And all of a sudden cool. the Mount Royal student body decides, no, this is how we cheer at basketball games. This is how we cheer at volleyball games. And it becomes the thing to do. There's no reason why that can't happen. It hasn't. But maybe all of a sudden it could. We
I think it's there. Yeah. I talked to JD Lewis from CJ92 and he was talking about concerts and Flames games and whatnot. And he's like, I just feel like there's going to be this social, like, I need to just be involved in something. And, you mentioned the Duke thing and all jokes aside, but that Duke Carolina game, as a Carolina fan, like, this is wrong. Like, I want the Carolina fans taunting us, getting on our face. And like, this is just wrong. It's so wrong that you don't have this right now. And
I totally agree. I've watched some games on TV, from Cameron and like I watched the Duke North Carolina game at Cameron where they lost in North Carolina. I will acknowledge, but it just wasn't the same, was it? Like
no,
it's not nearly as riveting or as exciting or enthralling or I don't know. Like it totally missing something. And maybe that comes back. Maybe there's such pent up demand to celebrate and show passion and be emotional that.
There's going to be that sense of school spirit too, right?
Fingers crossed it goes up.
These kids have been in, doing online courses and everything too. So like this idea for the social side. So hopefully that goes well, and we'll see where it goes. David, as always, I really value your opinion and everything like that. So it's great to pick your brain on something like this. And maybe when we get closer to March Madness, we will have you on to talk about that. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, folks. Cheers and enjoy the day, people.